Terra groaned under the weight of its scars. Warlords and techno-barbarian kings ruled with iron fists, carving their dominions from the planet's broken carcass. Among them, Hy Brasil was one of the greatest, a sprawling realm in Sudamerica ruled by the fierce and unyielding Dalmoth Kyn. From the Hive city of Sao Paolo, surrounded by the frozen expanse of the winter fields, Kyn commanded a proud and savage domain. His elite warriors, the Dracos clad in green-scaled armor, were legends of ferocity, their names spoken in awe and dread across the continent. But Terra's chaos had awakened something greater. The Emperor, master of conquest, sought to unite the fractured planet beneath his banner. His armies had broken countless kingdoms, and now his gaze turned southward. Hy Brasil, jewel of Sudamerica, would be the next to fall. This is their story. The Planalto rumbled with life, its towering hive spires piercing the polluted skies. Plasma reactors deep beneath the city churned ceaselessly, their heat exchange processes coating the winter fields in thick layers of frost. For the citizens of Sao Paulo, this was a day like any other. Workers trudged to their shifts in the industrial depths, their faces gaunt with exhaustion. Merchants filled the mid-hive marketplaces, hawking goods made from salvaged tech and crude materials. And high above, in the glittering citadel at the Hive summit, Dalmoth Kyn prepared for war. In the throne room of the Citadel of Scales, named for the coiled serpentine motif that adorned its steel walls, Kyn stood before a hololithic map of Sudamerica. His emerald-scaled cloak hung heavily across his broad shoulders, matching the ornate armor he wore, a gift forged by his artificers, said to be as unyielding as the man who ruled from within it. Kyn's eyes, sharp and relentless, scanned the flickering image before him. Red markers indicated the Emperor's advancing forces. They moved like a tide, sweeping away the lesser cantons of the south. Already, neighboring warlords had fallen or bent the knee to the unifier from the north. "Their pace quickens," murmured a voice at Kyn's side. Pherom Sichar, Kyn's nephew and most trusted advisor, stood cloaked in dark green robes embroidered with sigils of the old Hy Brasil dynasties. "The tribes of the Amazonie and the Yucatan have been broken. Soon they will reach our borders." "Let them come," Kyn growled, his voice low and rough. He turned to face Sichar, the steel glint of his gauntlets catching the light. "Hy Brasil is no crumbling canton. We are not the Yucatan, trading old relics for survival. We are the apex of Sudamerica, forged in war and blood. Let this emperor see what becomes of those who challenge the Dracos." Sichar's expression shifted slightly, caught somewhere between agreement and doubt. "They say his soldiers are unlike any others, my lord. Gene-forged warriors, armored giants. And we have plasma cannons, artillery, and warriors who know these lands as they know their own veins," Kyn snapped, his patience thinning. "The Emperor may march on Hy Brasil, but he will not leave it whole." Kyn's words echoed in the chamber, a proclamation as heavy as the silence that followed. Yet within the ruler's mind, a shadow of unease lingered. The Emperor was not like the petty kings of Terra, squabbling over scraps. He was something else, something relentless. And now, the storm was coming to Hy Brasil. The skies above Sudamerica were choked with ash as the Emperor's forces gathered at the borders of Hy Brasil. From the shattered jungle cantons to the ravaged highlands, the war machine of unification had swept southward, dismantling lesser kingdoms in its relentless advance. Now only the Planalto remained, its towers rising above the frozen winter fields like spears thrust toward the heavens. The vanguard was led by the Thunder Warriors. Behind them came the Auxilia, their disciplined ranks bristling with banners bearing the Emperor's sigil. Overhead, dropships screamed across the sky, deploying heavy armor and siege engines onto the cracked earth. This was no skirmish or probing raid, it was conquest incarnate. At the forefront of this colossal host stood the Emperor, his golden battleplate radiant even under Terra's polluted sky. He gazed at the distant hive spires of Sao Paulo. Beside him stood Malcador, the Sigillite, his dark robes stirring faintly in the wind. The Sigillite's keen eyes studied the horizon, where Hy Brasil's banners fluttered in the biting air. "Dalmoth Kyn will not yield," Malcador murmured. "He has made that clear with every missive we sent. His pride will drag this to blood." The Emperor's silence was answer enough. He did not turn from the city. His mind was already calculating, analyzing the resistance to come. "Preparations are complete, Lord," a general reported, stepping forward. He gestured toward the ridges where artillery was being positioned and siege engines readied. Their plasma reactors and the winter fields will complicate the advance, but it is manageable. The Dracos are assembling to meet us. The Emperor's gaze remained fixed on the distant spires. Begin. The order rippled through the chain of command, and the vast war host stirred to life. Siege engines ground forward, artillery began its deafening cadence, and the disciplined ranks of the auxilia advanced in perfect formation. Beyond the front lines, the Thunder Warriors moved like an avalanche, the first to meet the enemy head-on. Hy Brasil would not be taken easily, but it would be taken. The Emperor had judged the canton and its ruler, and their time had come to an end. Within the citadel of Scales, the war horns of Hy Brasil bellowed their call to arms, echoing across the towering Hive spires of Sao Paol. The sound was ancient and primal, a reverberation meant to shake the hearts of enemies and ignite the resolve of its people. In the shadow of the winter fields, the Dracos assembled. The warriors of Hy Brasil were a sight to behold, a blend of savagery and discipline honed by centuries of survival in Terra's most unforgiving age. They marched in serried ranks, their green-scaled armor catching the dim light as if forged from the hide of some ancient predator. Their helmets, styled like reptilian skulls, hid faces hardened by endless war. Plasma rifles, chain blades, and exotic weaponry scavenged from the ruins of the dark age of technology were in their hands, each soldier a testament to the brutal ingenuity of the realm they served. At their head stood Dalmoth Kyn himself, a titan of a man, clad in his signature emerald battle plate, its surface engraved with glyphs of Hy Brasil's ancient dynasties. His scaled cloak draped over one shoulder, his ornate plasma halberd resting easily in his grasp. Kyn's presence alone seemed to radiate an indomitable will, a force that demanded loyalty from those who followed him. "To your positions," Kyn bellowed, his voice amplified by Vox speakers mounted across the battlegrounds. The Dracos moved swiftly, deploying along the icy expanse of the winter fields and the elevated ridges surrounding the Hive cluster. Siege cannons were locked into place, their barrels aimed at the advancing tide of the Emperor's forces. Plasma turrets hummed to life, their charged cores glowing ominously in the frostbitten air. Pherom Sichar approached from the rear lines, his dark green cloak trailing behind him. Unlike Kyn, Sichar had a leaner build, more suited to the cunning of politics and strategy than the raw brutality of war. Yet, he was no less devoted to the defense of Hy Brasil. He spoke quickly, his tone sharp. "The Emperor's artillery is already in position. They've begun to shell the ridges, my lord. Their forward line is advancing in lockstep, Thunder Warriors at the vanguard." Kyn grunted, his eyes narrowing. "They'll try to break our lines through sheer force, the way they've done to every canton before us, but Hy Brasil is not like the others. They'll pay for every meter they take. We must not underestimate them," Sichar pressed, lowering his voice. "This is no warlord's rabble. This is a machine. Precision, strategy, strength beyond human limits. If we make a mistake..." "There will be no mistakes," Kyn interrupted, his tone final. "Hy Brasil stands. The Emperor may have his Thunder Warriors, but we are the Dracos, forged in fire and steel. He will learn that we do not break." Sichar hesitated, then nodded, retreating to oversee the artillery crews. As the final preparations were made, Kyn took his place at the front of the line, his halberd gleaming in the frost-laden air. Before him stretched the frozen expanse of the winter fields, the horizon marked by the distant movement of the Emperor's forces, a tide of gold, bronze, and steel, rolling forward with relentless purpose. The first shots of the siege rang out, and the ground trembled as the battle for Hy Brasil began. The frozen expanse of the winter fields erupted in chaos as the Emperor's forces began their assault. The distant rumble of siege artillery shook the air, and shells streaked overhead, slamming into the ridges where the Dracos had fortified their defenses. Explosions sent geysers of ice and shattered stone into the sky. But the warriors of Hy Brasil stood firm, their green-scaled armor glinting amidst the frost and smoke. The first wave of the Emperor's auxilia advanced in perfect formation, their movements methodical, their lines unwavering. They carried shields and las rifles, a wall of disciplined soldiers surging forward under the cover of their own artillery. Among them strode the towering forms of the Thunder Warriors, armored behemoths whose every step churned the frozen ground into mud. From the ridges, the Dracos unleashed their response. Plasma cannons hummed and spat their glowing payloads into the advancing lines, carving through ranks of auxilia with devastating precision. Volley after volley of rifle fire rained down from the defenders, while siege guns roared, targeting the lumbering forms of the Thunder Warriors. Several of the gene-forged giants fell, their armor split by concentrated plasma fire, but still they pressed on, unrelenting in their march. Dalmoth Kyn stood at the heart of the Draco lines, his plasma halberd at his side as he watched the battle unfold from a command post carved into the icy ridges. Around him, Vox operators scrambled to relay orders, their voices drowned out by the barrage of artillery fire that shook the earth. His green-scaled cloak billowed in the bitter wind, but Kyn remained motionless, his gaze locked on the battlefield below. "They're pressing harder," Pherom Sichar said as he approached, his voice clipped. He gestured to the hololithic display nearby, where red markers surged against the defensive positions of the Dracos. "The Thunder Warriors are breaking through the left flank. Our plasma turrets have slowed them, but they're regrouping. If they push again, that line won't hold." Kyn's jaw tightened. "Send the reserves to reinforce the flank and bring up the mobile batteries. The reactors must remain secure. If they breach the Hive's heart, this battle is lost." Sichar nodded and stepped away, barking commands into his Voxlink. Kyn turned his attention back to the battlefield, where the first lines of the auxilia had begun to falter under withering fire. Even as they fell, the Thunder Warriors surged forward, closing the distance to the Draco barricades. The monstrous warriors slammed into the defenders like a hammer, tearing through scaled armor and steel with terrifying efficiency. Kyn did not move from his position. He was no reckless warlord to throw himself into the fray for glory or bloodlust. He was the ruler of Hy Brasil, and his role was not to fight but to ensure the Dracos fought as one. Yet even he felt the weight of the Emperor's forces bearing down upon them. Through the smoke and chaos, Kyn caught a glimpse of the enemy leader, an immense figure clad in gold, standing far from the front lines. The Emperor. Kyn had read the reports, heard the whispers. He knew this was no ordinary conqueror, no mere man. But seeing him now, even at a distance, Kyn felt the enormity of the force that had come to destroy his kingdom. The battle raged on, the frozen field turning red with blood and fire as the Emperor's forces pressed ever closer. The Dracos held their ground, but Kyn knew the tide was shifting. The war for Hy Brasil had truly begun, and it would be decided in the crucible of the Hive itself. Smoke hung thick over the winter fields, mingling with the frozen air as the Emperor's siege ground forward. The ridges that once bristled with Hy Brasil's plasma turrets now bore the scars of relentless bombardment, their defenders forced to retreat closer to the Hive spires. Each Draco that fell was replaced by another, but their numbers dwindled as the Emperor's forces pushed forward, step by bloody step. The Emperor's artillery shifted its fire toward the Hive itself, targeting the defensive bastions built into Sao Paulo's outer districts. Massive shells struck the Hive's lower reaches, collapsing entire sections and sending plumes of debris into the already polluted sky. The Emperor's forces advanced behind this relentless barrage, their formations closing in around the Hive like a tightening noose. At a command center deep within Sao Paulo, Dalmoth Kyn paced before a hololithic map of the city. The sprawling conurbation was illuminated in harsh green light, its defensive perimeters marked with blinking sigils. Kyn's armored boots echoed sharply in the chamber as Pherom Sichar relayed updates from the front. "They've breached the third defensive line," Sichar said, his voice grim. "Their siege engines have cleared the way for the Thunder Warriors to reach the lower spires. We've collapsed several corridors to slow their advance, but they'll break through unless we commit more forces to the inner levels." Kyn stopped pacing and leaned over the hololith, his gauntleted hands gripping its edges. "How much longer until the reactor shields are fully reinforced?" 1 hour, maybe 2, Sichar replied. "If the Emperor's forces reach the reactor district before then, they won't." Kyn's voice cut through the air like a blade. He straightened, his plasma halberd resting against his shoulder. "Divert what forces we can spare to the lower spires. Every street, every corridor must become a killing ground. The Hive itself will fight for us, our choke points, our barricades, our traps. Make them bleed for every floor they take." Sichar hesitated, his expression cautious. "And what of the Emperor? He's yet to enter the Hive, but the moment he does..." Kyn's face hardened. If the Emperor himself steps onto the battlefield, it means he believes this war is already won. We'll show him otherwise. The chamber fell silent for a moment, the distant thrum of the Hive's plasma reactors vibrating through the walls. Kyn's commanders exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. They knew the stakes, and they knew their leader's resolve. Outside, the siege raged on. The auxilia moved methodically through the lower levels of the Hive, their las rifles firing in coordinated volleys. The Thunder Warriors were the spearhead, smashing through barricades and tearing apart defenders with raw strength. The Dracos fought back with tenacity, using the Hive's labyrinthine layout to ambush and outmaneuver their larger foes. Explosions tore through corridors as plasma charges detonated, collapsing pathways and burying invaders under tons of rubble. But for every victory, the Dracos paid dearly. Their warriors were exhausted, their numbers thinning. The Emperor's forces were relentless, their advance a grinding inevitability. Above the chaos, the spires of Sao Paol stood shrouded in smoke and fire, their silvered steel surfaces battered but unbroken. For now. Kyn's gaze turned upward, toward the peaks of his city where the Parliament House still stood, untouched by the war raging below. It was a symbol of Hy Brasil's pride, but even as he looked, he felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on him. The Emperor's forces were like a tide, and even the mightiest fortress could only withstand the ocean for so long. "Send the signal," Kyn said quietly to Sichar, his voice like distant stone grinding together. "Recall the Dracos from the outer defenses. We make our stand within the heart of the Hive." Sichar nodded, the faintest shadow of regret in his eyes. It will be done. As the Vox relayed Kyn's final orders, the city prepared for its last stand. Every remaining Draco, every weapon, and every ounce of resistance would be brought to bear. The Emperor had come for Hy Brasil, and Kyn would see the Hive burn before he gave it up without a fight. Sao Paulo was a city transformed by war. Its lower spires, once teeming with workers and merchants, had become charred ruins, corridors packed with rubble and the bodies of the fallen. The winter fields outside the Hive now resembled a smoldering graveyard, littered with wreckage and broken banners. Within the heart of the Hive, the echoes of battle reverberated through every level as the Dracos fell back to their final defensive positions. Dalmoth Kyn stood atop the reactor district's central control tower, surveying the labyrinthine layout of the Hive's inner sanctum. Beneath him stretched a network of barricades, choke points, and fortified bunkers. Every street and corridor leading to this point had been turned into a killing ground. The Dracos, those still able to fight, were entrenched here, their scaled cloaks flaring as they moved between positions. Pherom Sichar approached, his expression etched with fatigue. "The outer levels have fallen," he reported. "The auxilia are advancing through the lower sectors, and the Thunder Warriors are with them. We've delayed them, but their pace is accelerating. The Parliament House and the upper spires are secure, for now, but they've breached the reactor district's outer perimeter." Kyn nodded, his face carved from stone. He had expected this. The Emperor's forces were a machine, grinding forward no matter the cost. "The reactors are our lifeblood. If they take this district, the Hive will fall, and so will Hy Brasil. We hold here, Sichar." "Whatever it takes, we hold." Sichar hesitated for a moment before speaking. "And if they breach this level? If the Emperor himself enters the fray?" Kyn's gaze darkened as he turned to face his nephew. "Then we make him regret it." Below, the first wave of the Emperor's forces reached the barricades. Auxilia squads advanced cautiously, their las rifles sweeping the area as they moved. The Dracos, hidden among the frost-caked structures of the reactor district, opened fire. Plasma bolts streaked through the gloom, tearing into the tightly packed ranks of the auxilia. Explosions erupted as concealed charges detonated, collapsing walkways and crushing soldiers beneath tons of debris. But the Thunder Warriors were there, their towering forms unfazed by the chaos around them. They charged forward with terrifying speed, their immense bulk smashing through barricades and scattering defenders like leaves in a gale. The Dracos fought back with everything they had, plasma rifles, flamers, and grenades. But for every Thunder Warrior that fell, two more pressed forward. Kyn watched the carnage from the tower, his plasma halberd in hand. His commanders relayed updates from the front, each report more dire than the last. Still, he did not move. He was a ruler, not a soldier, and his place was here, directing the defense. But as the Thunder Warriors broke through another barricade, cutting down a squad of Dracos with horrifying ease, Kyn felt the weight of the battle pressing down on him. "Their momentum is unstoppable," Sichar said grimly, his voice barely audible over the roar of combat. "We're running out of fighters. The traps are buying time, but time is all they're buying." Kyn exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the advancing enemy. "Then we give them nothing. Not an inch of this hive. Not a single reactor. If they want this city, they will have to bury us with it." As the Emperor's forces pressed deeper into the hive, the last defenders of Hy Brasil prepared for the final confrontation. The once mighty city, Jewel of Sudmerica, was now a battlefield, a labyrinth of fire, ice, and steel. And at its heart, Dalmoth Kyn stood unyielding, ready to face whatever came next. Far above, the golden figure of the Emperor moved through the ranks of his soldiers, silent and deliberate. The time was coming, and soon the fate of Hy Brasil would be decided. The reactor district was a furnace of destruction. The hive trembled with every explosion, every salvo of plasma fire that scorched the air. The Dracos had drawn their lines deep within the maze of towering reactor stacks and frost-covered conduits, turning the labyrinth into a killing ground. But the Emperor's forces advanced all the same, relentless and methodical, their losses mounting, but their formation unbroken. The Auxilia moved in squads, las rifles lighting the gloom as they probed the Dracos' defensive lines. Each advance was met with ambushes, plasma fire from hidden emplacements, explosives triggered by concealed tripwires, even improvised barricades collapsing to crush entire platoons. The Dracos, fighting with the desperation of the doomed, exploited every inch of terrain to slow the invaders. But the Thunder Warriors could not be stopped so easily. The gene-forged giants drove forward with brutal efficiency, their massive frames shrugging off small arms fire and even glancing plasma shots. They smashed through barricades with their bare hands, dragged defenders from their positions, and left carnage in their wake. Slowly, inevitably, they began to overwhelm the Dracos' last line of defense. Dalmoth Kyn watched the battle from the command tower, his green-scaled cloak rippling in the cold wind. Below him, the maze of the reactor district was a vision of chaos, fire, smoke, and the dying screams of warriors. His gauntleted hands gripped the railing tightly as reports flooded in through the Vox. "They're through the western conduit," one voice crackled. "We can't hold them any longer, falling back to secondary positions." "Primary barricade Alpha 12 has been breached," another reported. Panic evident even through the distortion of static. "Thunder Warriors in the sector, we're losing ground." Kyn turned to Pherom Sichar, who stood hunched over a hololithic display, his face pale but composed. "Status?" Kyn demanded. Sichar's voice was steady, though grim. "The reactors are still shielded, but the Thunder Warriors are closing in on the control nodes. Once they secure them, it's only a matter of time before they disable the containment fields. If that happens," Kyn's eyes narrowed, "we know what happens." For a moment, the room was silent, save for the distant roar of explosions. The tension was palpable. Then, Kyn straightened, his voice cold and measured. "Pull back all surviving Dracos to the central complex. Consolidate our forces. If we can hold the main reactor chambers, we still have a chance to drive them out." Sichar hesitated. "And if we fail?" Kyn's gaze hardened. "Then Hy Brasil dies with us." The final order was relayed, and the Dracos fell back, retreating from their shattered positions to the heart of the reactor district. There, in the shadow of the Hive's colossal plasma cores, they made their stand. The towering generators loomed above them like ancient gods, their power thrumming through the air and filling the chamber with an eerie, otherworldly light. The Emperor's forces surged forward, their golden banners visible now even through the haze of smoke. Thunder Warriors led the charge, their massive frames illuminated by the pulsing glow of the reactors. Behind them came the Auxilia, moving with precise, mechanical discipline, their las rifles trained on every possible ambush point. Kyn stood at the center of the defensive line, his plasma halberd finally drawn and humming with lethal energy. He did not plan to fight yet. His place was still with his commanders directing the flow of battle, but the weapon in his hands felt heavier than ever before. Around him, the last remnants of the Dracos assembled, their green-scaled armor battered and bloodied, but their resolve unbroken. "This is it," Kyn said, his voice carrying across the chamber. "We fight here for Hy Brasil, for the Planalto, For the people who built this hive and kept it alive. If we fall, let it be as warriors, not as prey. The Dracos roared their agreement, raising their weapons in defiance. But even as they prepared for the final clash, the sound of footsteps echoed through the chamber. Heavy, deliberate, and impossibly calm. Kyn turned toward the source of the sound, his blood running cold as he saw the figure stepping into view. The Emperor had arrived. The sound of the Emperor's footsteps echoed sharply in the reactor chamber. Even with the clash of battle still raging beyond, the air felt weighted, the very space around him charged with an unnatural tension. He emerged from the smoke and shadows like a figure from myth, his golden armor reflecting the eerie glow of the plasma reactors. In his hand, he carried a great sword wreathed in flame, the blade casting flickering light across the chamber as if daring the shadows to defy him. At his side strode two custodians, their golden armor a match for the Emperor's radiance. Each was a towering figure of perfection, their weapons gleaming with lethal promise. One held a guardian spear, the other a sentinel blade and shield. They moved with the calm, unshakable precision of living demigods, their presence alone enough to cow any resistance. Behind them walked Malcador the Sigillite, his dark robes stark against the custodian's brilliance. His gaunt face was unreadable, though his eyes burned with the weight of millennia of knowledge. He carried no weapon, yet there was something about him, an unspoken authority that matched the warriors at his side. The contrast between him and the golden figures only emphasized the role he played, a voice of wisdom and subtle power amidst the storm of conquest. Dalmoth Kyn stood atop the defensive line, plasma halberd in hand. He did not flinch, though his eyes narrowed as he studied the man who had brought Terra's most powerful rulers to ruin. This was no conqueror driven by greed or desperation. This was something more, something far beyond Kyn's own ambitions. Behind him, the Dracos stood ready, their weapons held tightly. Even Pherom Sichar, always composed, cast a wary glance toward the Emperor and his companions as they stepped closer. "This is the man who calls himself the savior of Terra," Kyn said, his voice cutting across the silence. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. Every word carried weight, as if he spoke for his people, for the Hive itself. The one who burns cities to the ground and calls it salvation. What do you want, Emperor? To take this place and call it yours? To shatter what we've built and call it progress? The Emperor came to a halt, his golden helm tilting slightly, as if weighing Kyn's words. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm and steady, but it carried an undeniable authority that made the chamber itself seem smaller. "Hy Brasil is no common kingdom," the Emperor said, his tone neither cruel nor kind. "You are not the rabble I have swept aside on my path here. Among the ruins of Terra, your hive stands as a testament to what humanity can achieve, even in an age of chaos, a parliament, order, systems of governance that echo what once was." Kyn's expression hardened, his fingers tightening on his halberd. The praise felt like poison. The Emperor continued, taking another step forward. "You are among the most civilized of the barbarian states, and for that I offer you this, one last chance. Surrender, Dalmoth Kyn. Accept unification. Your hive and its people will live, and they will become part of something greater than themselves. There is no need for more death." The room fell into a heavy silence. Even the Dracos seemed stunned by the offer. Sichar's head tilted, and he glanced briefly at Kyn. "And what would we become under your rule?" Kyn said finally, his voice sharp. "Pawns in your empire? What would you take from us, Emperor? Our identity? Our culture? What would Hy Brasil be if it surrendered its soul?" The Emperor studied him for a moment, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of his flaming sword. "Hy Brasil would become a part of humanity's future," he said evenly. "But if you refuse, then it will become nothing at all. The choice is yours." Kyn's laugh was bitter. "You think I would kneel to you after all this? After the lives you've taken? The blood you've spilled? Never. You can raise these walls, slaughter my warriors, and turn my hive to ash, but you will not have my submission." The Emperor inclined his head slightly, as if Kyn's answer had been expected. "So be it," he said softly. He turned slightly, his gaze falling on Pherom Sichar, who had stood silently at his uncle's side. Malcador, who had remained quiet until now, shifted forward slightly, his voice low and deliberate. "Sichar," Malcador said, his words careful, "are you so willing to gamble the fate of your people? Is their annihilation preferable to a future under the banner of unity? I have seen leaders like your uncle before, those who would see their people bleed rather than let go of power. Ask yourself this: who do you serve? Him or the Hive? Kyn turned sharply to Sichar, his voice snapping like a whip. Don't listen to him, Pherom. He will break this place. He will break us. Sichar's expression was unreadable, his gaze flicking between Kyn, the Emperor, and Malkador. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but steady. I want what's best for Hy Brasil. He turned fully to the Emperor. If I accept your offer, the city is spared? The people are spared? The Emperor nodded. Hy Brasil will endure, and you will guide it through its transformation. The winter fields, the reactors, the Dracos, they will all serve the greater Imperium. Your people will live Sichar, but only if you take this step. Kyn's face twisted in fury. You would betray me, Pherom? Betray your own blood? I would save them, Sichar said quietly. You think this is pride, Uncle, but it's not. You've fought long enough. The Emperor is right. This is the only way forward. The Emperor gestured to the custodians, who stepped forward to Kyn's position. The Dracos raised their weapons, but Kyn's hand shot up, halting them. No, Kyn said, his voice low but resolute. He threw his halberd to the ground, the weapon clattering loudly on the steel floor. I will not grovel. Not to him. Not to anyone. The custodians seized Kyn, their immense hands locking around his arms as he was escorted away. Even now he stood tall, his head held high despite his defeat. Sichar stepped forward, his face a mask of grim determination. I will oversee Hy Brasil's assimilation, he said, his voice directed at the Emperor. But I will do so my way, with my people's best interests at heart. The Emperor inclined his head, approving. Then it is done. Kyn, still held by the custodians, turned one last time to Sichar. You think you've saved them, but you've handed our legacy to him. He will shape it into something you won't recognize. Sichar said nothing, and the chamber grew quiet once more as Kyn was escorted away. The Emperor turned to his forces, his voice calm yet commanding. Secure the city, search it for relics, begin the transition. The battle for Hy Brasil was over. The chamber was vast, its walls humming with the ceaseless energy of the plasma reactors that stretched upward like titanic monuments to human ingenuity. The air buzzed faintly with the raw power coursing through conduits and coolant lines, illuminating the space in an eerie, oscillating glow. These reactors had kept Hy Brasil alive for centuries, their energy feeding the Hive's insatiable hunger for industry and survival. Now, they stood silent witnesses to the Emperor's victory. The Emperor stood at the edge of a steel balcony overlooking the massive plasma cores. Their pulsing heat reflected off his golden armor as he gazed down into the heart of the reactors. At his side, Malkador stood in quiet contemplation, his dark robes a stark contrast to the gleaming surroundings. Behind them, custodians stood at attention, their watchful eyes scanning the chamber for any threat, their sentinel blades held steady. The output is extraordinary, Malkador remarked, his voice calm but tinged with awe. Even in its current configuration, these reactors generate enough power to sustain multiple Hive cities the size of this one. With proper refinement, they could be used for far more. The Emperor inclined his head slightly, his gaze still fixed on the reactors. Hy Brasil is no longer merely a kingdom, he said, his voice resonant in the cavernous space. It is a resource, a foundation. These reactors will fuel not just the survival of this hive, but the transformation of Terra itself. Malkador's sharp eyes flicked upward to meet the Emperor's profile. You intend to integrate them into the reconstruction efforts? The Emperor nodded slowly. Their energy will feed manufactorums, orbital defense platforms, and the hives that will rise to replace those ruined by war. This is no longer a world of isolated cities and warring tribes. It will become a world united, built on strength and purpose. He gestured faintly to the pulsing plasma cores. These machines will help to rebuild Terra, brick by brick, city by city. No longer will they serve one hive or one lord. They will serve humanity. Malkador's lips curved slightly in what might have been a faint smile. It is fitting, then, that the mightiest of the old kingdoms provides the foundation for the new. But what of the people? Not all will accept this transformation as easily as Pherom Sichar. Hy Brasil may be part of the Imperium now, but there will be those who resent what it has become. The Emperor turned his gaze toward Malkador. I have accounted for that. There will be resistance, as there always is when change comes. The integration will not be easy, but it will be done. These reactors will be guarded at all times by a permanent military garrison. The Dracos who survive will be reorganized, placed under new command, and stationed here to maintain order. If any of the Hive's citizens wish to sabotage these efforts, they will find no opportunity to do so. Malcador inclined his head. A wise precaution. A military presence will discourage rebellion, though it may also foster resentment. The Emperor's tone grew colder. Let them resent, let them struggle. Resentment and struggle are fleeting. The unification of Terra is not. These reactors, this hive, will be protected at all costs. Malcador studied him for a long moment before nodding. And what of Dalmoth Kyn? His imprisonment may not be enough to quell the whispers of rebellion. To some, he will remain a symbol, a rallying point for those who still dream of Hy Brasil as it was. Kyn is no longer their ruler, the Emperor said simply, his voice resolute. He is a relic of the past, a remnant of an age that has ended. Let him remain alive. His presence is of greater use as a reminder of what happens to those who resist unity than as a martyr for their cause. Malcador folded his hands into his robes, considering the Emperor's words. Pherom Sichar will need guidance. He may have accepted unification, but his people's loyalty will take time to secure. If left to his own devices, he may falter. The Emperor turned back toward the reactors, the rhythmic pulses of energy reflecting in the polished surfaces of his armor. He will not falter. I will ensure he remains steadfast in his purpose. Sichar is intelligent enough to understand that there is no path forward except the one I have laid before him. He will learn what it means to lead in the name of the Imperium. Malcador nodded, his gaze following the Emperor's back as the golden figure stepped closer to the edge of the balcony. Then Hy Brasil will not just endure, it will thrive, Malcador said, his tone carrying both certainty and the faintest hint of caution. The Emperor did not respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the immense plasma cores below. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, yet it carried the full weight of his unyielding will. Hy Brasil's purpose has changed. It will no longer be a city of isolation and pride. It will become part of something greater than it ever could have been alone. The work begins now. Behind them, the custodians stood unmoving as the Imperium's future unfolded in the glow of the reactors. Pherom Sichar stood on the steps of the Parliament House, his green cloak catching the warm glow of Sao Paolo's battered skyline. The towering spires of the Hive still stood, though they were scarred by the recent siege. Below, the city churned with activity. Labor crews, directed by the Emperor's logisticians, worked tirelessly to clear debris from the winter fields and rebuild the Hive's shattered outer levels. Auxilia patrols moved through the streets in formation, their presence a reminder that the Imperium's authority now extended here. Hy Brasil had changed in ways Sichar could scarcely process. Its people, though subdued by the Emperor's conquest, moved with a mixture of unease and hope, their expressions ranging from weary resignation to quiet determination. The Hive no longer belonged to itself. It belonged to Terra, to the Imperium. Sichar's thoughts were interrupted as the Emperor approached. Behind him, Malcador walked in silence, his dark robes trailing across the steps as two custodians followed at a respectful distance. Even here, in a city as vast as Sao Paulo, the Emperor's presence was overpowering. Workers stopped what they were doing to watch him ascend the steps, their gazes flicking nervously between their new ruler and Sichar. The Emperor paused beside Sichar, looking out over the bustling Hive below. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then, the Emperor broke the silence. The Parliament House will remain, he said, his voice calm yet resolute. It will no longer serve the petty ambitions of lords and tyrants, but it will have its place in the new order. The people of Hy Brasil will learn to serve not themselves, but humanity as a whole. Sichar looked out over the Hive, his hands clasped behind his back. You've left me to explain that to them, he said quietly, to make them understand why their sacrifices matter, to convince them that everything they've lost was worth it. The Emperor turned to him, his expression impossible to read. It was never a question of whether it was worth it, Sichar. It was necessary. Unity always comes at a price. But now, your people have a future that extends beyond the walls of this Hive, beyond the borders of Hy Brasil. They will see it in time. Sicar's jaw tightened, but he nodded. You've placed a heavy burden on me, my lord. I will carry it, as I promised, but not all will accept this new future so easily. That is why you are here, the Emperor replied. You know this hive better than anyone. You know its strengths and its weaknesses. Use that knowledge to guide it into the Imperium. And if the people resist, remind them that this was the only path. Behind them, Malcador stepped forward, his voice measured. We've begun assembling the military garrison as you commanded. The surviving Dracos are being restructured and retrained under Auxilia command. Those who remain loyal will keep watch over the reactors and maintain order in the hive. Those who do not, he let the sentence hang, his meaning clear. Sicar exhaled. The Dracos were proud. Some will refuse to fight under the Imperium's banner. Malcador's gaze sharpened. Pride is a luxury they can no longer afford. If they refuse to adapt, they will become a threat, and threats must be dealt with. The Emperor inclined his head, his tone steady. There will be no rebellion here, Sicar. Not from the Dracos, not from the people. Make no mistake, Hy Brasil is now a part of something far greater than itself. If there are those who cannot accept that, then they will not be allowed to endanger what we are building. Sicar said nothing for a long moment. The sounds of labor crews echoed below, the hum of plasma machinery blending with the shouts of foremen and the rhythmic march of Auxilia patrols. Finally, he spoke. I will do what must be done, he said, but the people of this hive will not be ruled through fear alone. They will need hope if they're to accept this new order. The Emperor regarded him for a moment before nodding. Hope will come, Sicar, but not yet. For now, you will give them stability, order. The rest will follow. Sicar turned back to the hive, his expression distant. He had won the Emperor's favor, had secured the survival of his people. But at what cost? The Parliament House loomed behind him, its steel and stone untouched by the battle, yet it felt hollow now, like an artifact of a world that no longer existed. The Emperor stepped past him, descending the steps toward the hive below. The custodians followed silently, their golden forms gleaming in the fading light. Malcador lingered for a moment, his sharp gaze fixed on Sicar. You have a rare opportunity, Pherom Sichar, Malcador said, his tone low but pointed. Do not squander it. Sicar didn't respond as Malcador turned and followed the Emperor down the steps. He remained where he stood, watching as the hive continued its transformation. Hy Brasil had survived, but it would never be the same. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the fall and transformation of Hy Brasil. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time.